Humanity was just starting to figure out how to farm when the oldest living tree on Earth sprouted. Entire empires can rise and fall in the span of time it takes one of these bristlecone pines to become the equivalent of a toddler. I'm Dawn Nakagawa, the president of the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles, and this is Futurology. Depending on the perspective, the metabolism of humanity is either extraordinarily fast or excruciatingly slow. We measure time today in election cycles, market cycles, news cycles, but the cosmic clock ticks at a much slower pace. Stars are born and extinguish on timescales so vast that all the drama we're dealing with here on Earth is barely a smudge of sentience on the infinite window of time. Atlantic writer Ross Andersen works to bring these absurdly unfathomable chronological disparities of deep time into focus. For his stories, he often travels the world in search of what has long passed and what is slowly coming. On this podcast, we often talk about the future racing ahead of our concepts. Ross spoke with Futurology producer Grant Slater about how it is comically laughable to describe a future that stretches out as far as our past. Ross writes that there's nothing we can know in our all-too-brief present about how the machine intelligences we're creating will perceive time. We only know that they can devour the entirety of human culture and knowledge in a matter of months, and make decisions in milliseconds that would take us hours, months, or forever. He writes that this speed and certainty tempts us to hand AI the nuclear launch codes, and how an artificial finger on the big red button could be a harbinger of a future in which everything we know disappears in a dozen flashes of light that would register as an instantaneous flicker from the vantage point of our galactic neighbors. And now, Ross Andersen and Grant Slater on Futurology.
Hello, Ross.
Grant, it's good to see you, man.
Yeah. We're giving away the game already. We know each other, but we'll talk about that. So it's hard to say when we should start at the beginning, whether we should start at the beginning of the universe, the beginning of life on Earth, or with the oldest living thing on Earth, or with the beginning of our relationship, which are kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
This article that you wrote for Aeon Mag, was this the first article you ever wrote?
Yeah, this essay on Bristlecone pines was my first piece for Aeon magazine. That's right.
This is a piece about the Bristlecone pines, which are the oldest. Well, it's hard to say. There's like different qualifications of what the oldest living thing on Earth is. It gets a little bit complicated.
It does.
But you wrote this beautiful essay, which was around 6,000 words. You like to write long things. I know this about you. But I found it really beautiful. I thought it was really well written. And it took place here in California at a place called the White Mountains, which are on the California-Nevada border. And when I read this article, I was living in California and I loved it. And I was like, reached out to you totally cold, maybe through Twitter too, but I'm not sure where, maybe email. Yeah. And I was like, can I turn your 6,000 word essay into like a 5-minute video?
Yeah.
Which was a little bit, you were a little nervous, but it turned about cutting it down. You were a little nervous about cutting it down from like 6,000 to 600 words.
Sure.
But it turned out great. I spent 3 weeks at 13,000 feet. I think it's 13,000-ish.
Yeah. Shooting gorgeous footage.
Like time lapses of trees, which basically I was like watching the stars go over trees, and it was like negative 10 degrees at night. And then we met for the first time because you came out to Bishop, California, near the Bristlecone pines. And then we recorded this, and that was kind of the beginning of our relationship, but our relationship has extended since then, and it kind of weaves into various parts of your career, which we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
What was that article about?
So I wanted to look at two very long-lived trees, the bristlecone pine and the coast redwood, and to think about how they were different and just like kind of think about them as different organisms and what that tells us about, thinking long-term and all this sort of thing. So I went and did the reporting trip, not quite as extensive as yours, your 3 weeks up in the White Mountains, but I did the reporting trip. I went up there for a couple of days, and I just was enchanted by these trees and that landscape. I mean, you were up there, but you can kind of see into, right, like the basin and range on one side. And then on the other side, you can see just the majestic Sierra. After that, we went up to Jedediah Smith State Park, which is in quite near the Oregon border, to look at the redwoods. And I got a guide who took me out to the ones that are in the wild trees, which is a very famous Richard Preston book about like the very, very tallest coast redwoods, and took some cool pictures, got caught in like a kind of cool, scary windstorm in the redwoods. But when I came back, first of all, like there'd been to that point so much writing about the redwoods, going back to Muir, but like just in general, there was like a huge existing literature. But I also realized that like the kind of comparing of the two trees, like was a bit of a writerly conceit, the kind of thing that like sounds great in your head in the pitching phase, but then when you go to execute on it, like seems a little pretentious. And I just found that my imagination had been captured by the bristlecones. And so, usually, if you have time, and I did have time in this instance, I think I was writing that piece over kind of a period of 3 months or so. The story kind of reveals itself. And so as I sort of pushed deeper into just what these organisms were, and how they existed and what it even means to have a continuous life that lasts for millennia, the climate change angle, which to be honest, was not something that was really even on my radar initially. Like I was only thinking about them as long-lived trees. And then when I didn't discover, obviously other people had discovered, scientists were doing this for a while, but when it occurred to me that they were kind of like recording the climate for us while also being victims of it, because
in their mini tree rings, like every year,
yes,
thicker, thinner, like, it's like a record of history dating back, in this case, Methuselah, the oldest tree, 4,850 and change, maybe 60 by now, years old, which is the oldest living tree on Earth, allegedly. So in these rings is the history of the climate, just like ice cores.
Yeah. And the fact that they were sort of recording their own demise in a way, because as the climate gets warmer, these bristlecone pines they like these really high, dry, cool habitats, and those are going away, and some of their predators, like bark beetles, are moving up the slopes towards them as the earth warms. And the fact that they were kind of etching that into their rings, like that very process, I thought was like, there was like a really poetic aspect to that, and came up with this kind of image of like sort of the burning of the Library of Alexandria, that these were like kind of nature's great scrolls, that were catching fire because of some vandals, in this case, us.
Yeah. And that tree, the oldest tree on Earth, is a closely guarded secret. Go to the Bristlecone pines, but you won't find Methuselah because somebody knows where it is. Do you know who knows?
The park rangers certainly know.
The park rangers
will not. They're, those guys are.
They must like swear them to secrecy when they get the job or something.
Totally.
And there's a reason, right? Because there used to be a different tree, Prometheus.
Yeah.
Which, like, obviously all these things are happening. Like, it's a guess, a little bit, but a ballpark guess. But at the time it was cut down, they estimate it was 4,862 years old, which is older than Methuselah. And somebody, a park ranger, right? Like wandered his way up there doing research possibly for the good.
Yeah.
But his research was to cut down trees. And he cut down Prometheus, the oldest tree on Earth. Like, what a horrible day on the job.
Oh, man. Brutal.
You can't even imagine.
Like, really. Yeah, that's a tough one to shake off, man. Even not just that day, like 10 years later. Like, what do you have to do as a park ranger to like make up for that?
Oh, man.
As your career.
I mean, yeah, I can't.
You got to save a lot of kids, search and rescue stuff.
Totally. But it's also a little bit more complicated than that. So we have this sort of back and forth, but it's not just trees. Like, a more interesting question is kind of like the oldest living thing on Earth.
Yeah.
Which is like, what is a thing is kind of the center of that question. So a good example is like clonal colonies of aspens. So there's Pando, which is the giant aspen in Utah, that is very old as well, 14,000 years, but it's not like a single body. It's like this communicative sort of like symbiont being, right?
Yeah.
My personal favorite is the the king creosote, which is also a clonal body. Like a creosote is a bush that sort of grows in a circle, but it's also connected to these like broader ranges of circles across the desert.
Is that the one in South America somewhere?
No, the creosote is here in California.
No way.
Near Joshua Tree.
Cool.
This is not a hidden secret. You can go find it.
Okay.
You can go walk among it.
And it's a single body?
It's a single body, but it kind of comes out from different parts of the ground, like
That's
in
rad.
these like kind of circles.
Yeah.
You like to take trips. I like to take trips. Like
Yes,
we're going to
we
be
do.
like giving a lot of travel recommendations along.
That's right.
Yeah. So if you go to Joshua Tree, you can go north past Giant Rock and you'll end up like wandering among the oldest living.
How old is that one?
11,700 years old.
I feel like that one should count. Like that.
Yeah,
that seems like the champion to me. The Aspen thing is a little bit of a cheat.
Yeah. Yeah. I think all this begs the question, which is something I'm still curious about after like 10 or 12 years.
Yeah.
What do you write about?
Yeah. Gosh. I'm still trying to find out. My editors are still trying to find out. This is like I feel like on my annual review every year at the Atlantic, it's kind of like figure out what you write about. Look, I'm sort of a shameless dilettante. I think that you can overthink what you write about and get kind of formulaic in terms of the sort of stories that you're looking for. Whereas, I've had mixed success with this approach, but I do think that kind of having more of a kind of bright, shiny object approach, where you sort of wait for things to kind of seize you. And usually at the beginning of that, you aren't really entirely clear on why they've seized you. I mean, obviously there's like commonalities, like I've written a lot about animals, about the cosmos, kind of, writ large, certainly about deep time. I just think whenever you kind of really have an occasion to contemplate that while you're in the grove of ancient trees or staring out into the cosmos, it always kind of gets me off in a certain way.
And just like imagining like these huge numbers that you're like super into. Like, I just want to bring up a few of them because in one of your articles, you brought up this thing, the coolest page on Wikipedia, which is the timeline of the far future. So in 100K years, all the stars in the sky will change and we will see different constellations than we do today because we will have moved. In 2 million plus years, the Grand Canyon will erode until it is a broad valley surrounding the Colorado River. In 1 trillion years, that's when stars stop forming. Mm-hmm. But then a ridiculous number, 10 to the 10 to the 120, the highest estimate for the time it takes for the universe to reach its final energy state. Mm. Like when you think about these things, like, and put cosmologies on them, it's like, it's mind blowing. And it's like, it stretches our awareness, stretches our consciousness,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
What has brought you to these like large numbers?
I think it's the same thing we were talking about earlier is that like, if you can, you look at a story and if you look at it too close in time, right, you're missing context. Viewed from a kind of broader temporal context, I just often think that like the shape of the story really tends to look different,
You wrote this article kind of about the beginning of the universe and like how we're like not making a lot of progress back then, at least about figuring it out.
And still,
it's a hard one to figure out. It's a hard one to crack, but I constantly read like, oh, well, that thing we thought about how the universe started, like we were totally wrong. Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
Like, it's like almost like they're making it up in real time, like jazz. Yeah. But I think in that article, it kind of referenced these ideas of like cyclical universes. Like if the universe is expanding someday, maybe it'll collapse and then it'll go around. And again, so like these ideas that we make up in our heads, these different cosmologies, like the one we know that is wrong is the earth is flat, like that we're the center of the universe. But like some of the other ones, like actually might've been a good idea, especially as it relates to the cosmology of Hinduism. So you have these like cycles, like kalpas. I think one of them that I remember was like, okay, well, if a dove flies by a rock every day, like a giant boulder, and brushes its wing lightly against the boulder, when the boulder is gone, that's when the era has ended.
Yeah. I mean, in the cyclical universe, right? For more than 100 years now, it has seemed like the smart money that you will have heat death, right? That the universe, that its energy will dissipate as it expands and kind of just fades out into nothing, the final energy state, in your poetic phrase. Because the cosmology story as a physical theory is so incomplete and gets more incomplete by the day. I mean, I did a story earlier this year about the cosmological constant and the big issues there. I just think our final theory of the universe, like we don't have it. We really don't have it on like a lot of different fronts. And so when you have questions that are that big remaining, I just think some of those conclusions that were arrived at previously, like whether the universe is cyclical, being a kind of great example of one, are still open questions. And I would not say, first of all, I'm not a cosmologist, but I also would hasten to add that I still think there's like better reason to think that it actually does expand out forever and you get heat death, but just that like the book is not closed on that.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that these cultural touch points of ethics and morality do play into these ways that we conceive of the universe sort of in the Western Platonic sense, all the way back to thinking about these other conceptions where they were supertuned into consciousness, like especially maybe native cosmologies too. We might be getting back to that anyway, like maybe the universe is made of consciousness. People aren't putting that one away either.
Yeah, no, they're not.
That one's actually growing.
It's not a dead theory. And so I'm still kind of, I guess, looking for stories that give me that kind of sense of deep time wonder. But not only deep time wonder, there's other stuff as well.
Yeah, you're right about the sublime and only, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it, right? Like, yeah.
No, that's not true. We're going to talk about some dystopian crap in a second. But how did you become a journalist?
I mean, it really was like months before I met you, maybe a year before I met you. I was in law school at Georgetown. I had done a kind of mix of stuff after I got out of college, and then decided I should be like, learn to do something useful, learn to be an attorney, and maybe apply my skills, in some way that would suit the public interest. And I started doing that, embarked on my legal training and found it genuinely fascinating, but also did have some questions about how good I would be at it, partly because the writing is quite formulaic. And I don't say that to disrespect it, because like the arguments, inside of it are very sophisticated, obviously. But yeah, I just thought it was kind of limiting, and I also just kind of started writing again at that time. I had, in my late teens, early 20s, I had like part of a novel in a drawer, and, was kind of had always kind of dabbled in creative writing, but then had put it away for years and years. And then I was, I guess, 29 or 30 or thereabouts. And the first thing I wrote actually was for The Atlantic, weirdly enough. Alexis.
Alexis Madrigal.
Yes. Our mutual friend, Alexis Madrigal, took a chance on me writing an essay about space exploration. It's a very short thing. I did that. And then the next thing I wrote was like a big essay about a space telescope, the James Webb Space Telescope, which is now in orbit. At the time was very overdue. Yeah. And after that, the next one I did after that was the Bristlecone Pines.
Wow. But that's kind of a leap, right? Like you've chosen this path, you've maybe invested money in like this sort of one thing that you think you're going to be, and like making that jump. Was there an emotional valence to it?
Yeah, for sure. It definitely felt like a risk, especially since like one of my main motivations for doing it was just a lot more fun, again, getting back to kind of my dilettantish nature. Like I just love learning about new things and not kind of tunneling down and specializing, and so a job where you are kind of paid to go deep on stuff for maybe a period of weeks, maybe a period of months, and then you turn to something new, I just found like really, really compelling. There were some late nights, some long talks with my spouse. Katie and I really kicked it over a lot. I mean, obviously this was a risky journey, but I was getting like some marketplace signals that suggested that I had some skills that might be valuable in this world where I wouldn't be like unemployed a year or two in. But but yeah, it was a scary time in my life for sure.
And it's interesting because you've been doing this for, I'm not going to say so long, but now for 13 or 14 years, right? 15? Yeah. As I was looking back at your body of work for this interview, like it's interesting because you do kind of get this like short, deep time aspect. Like if you're writing about the future and then the future comes, you can go look back. And a good example is this idea of like indigenous migration to North America. So for the longest time, this is the one like we all heard in elementary school, right? Okay. So like there was a time when Russia was connected to Alaska and they walked and it was like real cold, and then they came down and eventually made it to a place that sucked less, although, the Inuit would probably disagree.
Sure.
And that was how we got here. But that's not what we think today.
Well, it's very much contested, but yes, that story was so fascinating to me. I mean, so yes, all of us got this education that you describe, right? Which is, people coming over the Bering Strait, Beringia, which a subject that maybe we'll return to. These were the Clovis people, right? They're thought of like they have like a kind of type, right? They're like big game hunters. These are the people that are chasing mammoths south through the kind of heart of the North American continent. And there had been, going all the way back to the 70s, a theory that at the time was considered to be quite fringe, which was that actually the first people to come to the Americas were like a boating people, and that they had kind of traveled across like the whole Pacific Rim, right? Like there was some like very scattered evidence, and this is the problem, by the way, with writing about Paleo-Indian archaeology. Like when that piece went to fact checking, like you really realize that the whole body of evidence for like 1,000-year periods could fit in a shoebox. So people are drawing really, really vast conclusions and telling very big stories based on like a very thin evidence base, But anyway, there were like some arrowheads and fish hooks that resembled, from like a fishing culture off Japan, from let's say 20,000 years ago. And then similarly down in like Baja California. And so people started to think like, wow, I wonder if there was a kind of like Pacific Rim boating culture that actually pre-existed, like the Clovis migration. And that for me, as a person who, as we say, is interested in deep time, is interested in what the world was like 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 years ago, was already kind of an irresistible story. But what added it kind of like a really fascinating element was that the reason that the archaeological record of this civilization would have been gone is that the sea levels have risen, right? So you have climate change, right? We know what happened at the end of the Ice Age, which is that all sea levels went up around the whole world drastically. And so if there was this coastal culture that was going up and down the Pacific coast of North America well before the Clovis people, all their little, all their shell middens, all their, the archaeological record of them just got
pieces
swamped.
of their canoes,
even their canoes washed out to sea.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was so fascinating. And the science itself, they're doing this like undersea archaeology, and they've just started doing it. I also love, this, to get into your like, what do you like to write about? I love writing about things where we're not at the proof point yet. So we can like explore the idea fully, but I'm not on the hook for like maybe they'll never find it, maybe they'll never have our woolly mammoths out in Siberia, but like you could just like use kind of nonfiction to really stretch the imagination for what's possible. And so that piece I thought was just super fascinating.
Yeah, we're about to head to Siberia for sure. But before we get there, I want to go to the Channel Islands. Yeah, because these guys were like sort of like plying the edge of things, which is like sort of the area where, evolution brought us out. Like this sort of interesting life happens right at the edge, like especially here in California, we have the kelp. I don't know what it's called, like the
Kelp Forest Highway.
Kelp Forest Highway. Yeah. So this like
it's great fishing grounds, right?
So you could just kind of like coast, along the coast, and this is how people got down to the Channel Islands, which is one little factoid from this story that I loved, which is like there used to be these like little baby mammoths like off the coast of California.
Yeah. So the idea is that either there was a land bridge from the ice or some other conditions that allowed a mammoth population to go out to the Channel Islands. Most people know the Channel Islands from Catalina, but there's actually a whole string of them that go basically from around San Clemente or like San Diego all the way up to like kind of just north of Santa Barbara.
There's like all these endemic like weirdo species out there.
Yeah, I'm gonna blank on the name. The island fox.
The island fox.
The island fox. They're what's crazy is they haven't had natural predators in forever, and so they're like we had a campfire. I was sitting with the archaeologists like out on some bluff, and we set up camp for the night. We like got our fire going, and like there's like 2 or 3 foxes just roll up to the camp and are just like kind of chilling with you, like hey guys, because they're really not predated. In fact, the golden eagle started picking them off. They flew over there.
While you were there?
No.
Sorry.
No. It's like over a period of decades, and like these scientists figured out this really ingenious way to like get the golden eagles off the island because they were just like rampaging on these foxes that hadn't been predated in thousands and thousands of years. But so yes, the Channel Islands. There was a land bridge out there. Some mammoths made it out there, but they didn't have a lot to eat after they got. So then the land bridge goes away. They're an isolated population, right? There's not a lot to eat, and so whenever that happens, evolution gets into this like pygmy mode, right, where it starts shrinking the species over time. And so they had these kind of like real tiny like kind of like little like
mammoths.
sweet baby mammoths, like kind of. I think I don't want to be wrong in this podcast, but I think of them as being like bigger than like a mastiff, but like not that much bigger.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty small for an elephant.
It's pretty small.
A furry elephant.
That's cool. They're probably bigger than that, but somewhere in that zone.
But what happened? So these humans are like making their way around the Pacific Rim, and eventually they're going to get to this island.
Yeah. Well, so it's not even that eventually. It's like that was kind of the first port of call because the way that the ice sheet laid on the northern part of the continent, it like left very little coastline north. So you'd have like some inlets like at the Columbia River, right, where you could go. But other than that, it was like the ice would come like flush right up to the coast. And so the Channel Islands were kind of like one of the first places where like you could land. That whole area, I think, was just like paradise when they arrived there. And so they appeared, they stayed there. The Chumash are like descended from these people, it seems like. And, fishing culture is just like a way easier vibe than hunting mammoths, in the cold hinterlands in the middle of the continent.
So they never touched the mammoths?
What's that?
They never touched the mammoths? They left them alone?
I'm sure those mammoths didn't last long once people got there.
Yeah, which is kind of a running story that we've tracked a little bit ourselves.
Yes.
I told the story of how we met, but I think I'm going to leave this one to you. Like what happened? What was going on?
Our next adventure?
Yeah.
So the next time that Grant and I got to work together was I was doing a story about a place called Pleistocene Park, which is in far east Siberia. And it's a place where there's a father-son science team who want to bring back woolly mammoths and really kind of geoengineer the Siberian Arctic to be what it was, which was a fabulous grassland previously. And Grant and I were having one of our usual kind of quite stimulating calls, and I had mentioned this to him, and he, Grant being quite an accomplished filmmaker by this point was like, well, I want to make a film about it, and I was like, cool, let's do it together.
And you need a Russian translator.
Grant spoke Russian, but the story that I actually have to tell about this is when we arrived in Siberia. So one thing whenever I talk about how we went and did this story is that like there's a place called Yakutsk in Siberia, which if you read normal accounts of Siberia, people are like, oh, Yakutsk, like that is the end of the road. For me to get there from DC, it was like fly to Paris, fly to Moscow, take 2 or 3 flights before I even got to Yakutsk. And you're like the end of the road there. And then where we were going was like another 6 hours northeast beyond Yakutsk.
On this like little propeller plane.
Yes, on a little propeller plane. Very scary adventure. We arrived in this place called Chersky, which used to be like part of the Gulag. And Grant had like a luggage mix up. The airline had lost his bag in Moscow, so he had he had to buy all these clothes like that, like just in the Moscow airport, including like T-shirts that were like Russia is a great power, like Vladimir Putin is a great man. Like this is the clothes he's wearing.
Yeah,
and but he also, through no fault of his own, just because he was we had kind of figured this out at a short scale or a short time frame, he didn't have his like exact like papers that you needed because this is a special military controlled zone in Siberia. But anyway, this is a situation where like we land and like there's like Russian soldiers board the plane and like march right up to us and like give us your papers, like in like not nice way. And Grant's papers were like deemed to be unsatisfactory, and so he had to go get interrogated, and I went with them, and so did our
like at the
our
local
science host.
KGB office.
Yeah, like at the base, these Russian soldiers, and the whole time he's wearing this shirt that says Russia is a great power. While they're
I
answering
forgot
his
about
questions.
the shirt, but it probably worked in my favor.
I think. Well, maybe, I don't know. I think they sort of thought it was like tongue in cheek. Like
Oh
that you were
man,
like kind of
the
shitting
levels
on Russia.
of like I think Russian soldiers in the hinterlands don't have much level of irony, like
Okay,
awareness.
Fair enough.
So the basic idea of Pleistocene Park is that this father and son team are shipping as many animals as they could, which is obviously a very difficult shipping route, as you just described, as many large mammals as they could to a very small plot of land on the bank of a river, with the hope that these animals will trample down all the trees and make the ground like sort of back to a grassland like it was during the Pleistocene, which is like, people don't think about it, but like the Arctic during the Pleistocene in the summer would have been like the African savanna, just like amazing amounts of biomass of animals, and like sort of like lording over them all is this like giant fat furry elephant, like the mammoth that's like Nikita said they knock down trees.
I think anytime you have like a ton of big herbivores, like the American bison are a great example, right? Like part of the reason we have a grassland there, right, was that they were just like pretty they were vigilant about keeping the trees down.
Yeah. And all of this is in the service of trying to keep the permafrost frozen, because underneath the ground is the biggest store of carbon on Earth.
Yeah, methane. So it's a much more intense greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, like by a factor, I think, of 10. The bright side, it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere, so it goes away quicker. But there's lots of people who think this is the big time bomb on the planet, that if the permafrost starts melting really fast, you get one of these really nasty feedback loops where the methane escapes into the atmosphere. You get even more greenhouse effect. It gets even warmer. Then even more permafrost comes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how you get kind of like the kind of real scary 5-6 degrees C scenarios.
Yeah. And at the poles, these feedback loops are stronger. So, but there's one kicker to the story. The site at the time was sort of selected as the most likely release zone of what would become reincarnated woolly mammoths using DNA.
Yes, or just like CRISPRing an Asian elephant, really. So like just like tweaking the genes of an Asian elephant to make it, that's what a mammoth is, right? Like they got all those little tricks that the cold adapted animals got. And so they're like, can you fast track that with gene editing? But yeah, I was just really enchanted by the reincarnated mammoth, and that whole idea. But when you look at humans and the whole kind of arc of the human species, there's a turning point when we start to really shift the ecologies here on this planet, and unambiguously for the worse. Yeah, I mean, people really rampaged across the planet. I mean, you can understand why.
It didn't take long either, too. It was like a very short period of time.
Well, if you invent the spear, like all of a sudden you're like, wow, like we could be feasting every single night because you just had this abundance, because it was really hard to kill animals like that before you have technology of that sort, right? So once they did that, and it's funny, you can just see how that happened, how wherever humans went, even into the ocean. Because then once we were able to get on the ocean in large numbers, we immediately started whaling, right? And so then you get the megafauna of the sea as well. Anyway, to me, that is kind of the original sin ecologically, right? That's like the first place where you see humans intervening in the natural environment in ways that are kind of just unambiguously bad for the planet, bad for our fellow creatures in like a really kind of dramatic way. And so to me, the idea that as part of our, our quest to reverse or at least mitigate the effects of climate change, that we would kind of like summon this victim of our original ecological sin. There was just a poetics to that I thought was irresistible.
Yeah.
And so then it was just a matter of like, can we tell a real nonfiction story that gets to that idea?
Yeah.
And I think we did.
Sure.
And
we did a great
if
job.
I could brag on Grant's behalf here, like you also did this gorgeous film about this that ended up in the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. I went and saw it. It's amazing.
That was a fun one to make for sure. The connection here to the Long Now Foundation, which is this organization based in the Bay Area that focuses on deep time, interested in the work of George Church, who was a DNA geneticist who worked with these kinds of recreation experiments, and he was pretty confident and told the guys in Russia that he was pretty confident that the mammoth was coming soon.
Yeah.
But it was like a while ago. I still don't have a mammoth.
They got a woolly mouse. Did you hear this?
Oh yeah, the woolly mouse has arrived. So like the mouse will scare the elephant out of its extinction.
They need like a good like press event every year, I think, and the woolly mouse is the most recent one. Is impressive work though. They like basically, just like we were talking about, they like turned on all those like kind of cold weather traits in this little mouse. So the Long Now, for those that aren't familiar, is started by a handful of guys. This is, I think, part of the problem with the Long Now is they were like, it's like a very dudely kind of outfit, but it was like Kevin Kelly, Stuart Brand,
editor of Wired, the creator of the Whole Earth Catalog. And
yes. Who else was it? Anyway, a bunch of people, they wanted to think in like 10,000 year increments and kind of pop out the human frame of reference. And and this has traveled through a lot of my work, right? I think that's like a really stimulating thought exercise for almost any story that you're thinking about, is to like pop out the time frame, right? And resituate it in that way, zoom out in time and see how it looks different, and what kind of stories shake out of that. And that really was a mental trick, I think, that certainly I learned from those Long Now guys, and one reason that they've been criticized is, when you look at the whole cultural milieu from which the Long Now emerged, it's a very kind of like prosperous Bay Area tech kind of culture, right? This is like the first .com boom kind of produced this culture, Now we've got all the money in the world. Like what sort of grand ways can we start thinking, when you then have down cycles, or at least in our current culture, tech and leaders in tech are viewed more as like quite unsavory figures, by certainly the world of arts and letters. The Long Now people were kind of like quite unapologetically attached, I think, to the tech world in a way that, in ways that I think to some degree were defensible, and like actually like, look, I don't mind saying that technology has been like a kind of wonderful force for good in the history of human civilization, and it's important to recognize that, even if like some of these robber barons might be bad guys, and so I think they stuck to their convictions on that, but they were also, I think, there's just that whole like aughts froth, where everyone was just kind of like congratulating themselves on being the smartest guys in the world, in the tech and kind of culture space to the extent they were attached. Yeah. I think they were very much of a piece with that, and that has not aged well.
Yeah, because of the things that they were trying to do required this sort of scale, and we could talk about a few of them, but like sort of the quintessential example of this is like Jeff Bezos paying for like a giant 10,000 year clock that gets buried in a mountain, and like that's a huge amount of effort and money to make something that is like of like questionable utility. But I think that there's like this other side of it, which is sort of as good intentioned as Stuart Brand or Kevin Kelly might be, these early sort of like counterculture figures who made Silicon Valley like what it is today, like the OGs, you can see the strains of this ideology pushing into today, like in the form of something like effective altruism. Or less wrong, like sort of like really logic-based, like programming-based ways of understanding the world. You can see it most prominently in the form of one, Elon Musk, the Doge leader. Like Elon's whole like reason for doing everything he's doing is this,
like a long-termist,
long-termism.
Yeah, and I guess what I would say to that is it's not the long-termism that's the problem there. It's like, which long-term story are we telling, right? If Elon says, the long-term viability of human civilization depends upon, us getting to Mars, at some before like an asteroid strikes or there's some other extinction event on Earth. Like, let's just like grant that for a second, and say like, hey, okay, like I guess it's true that we could have a planetary catastrophe and that we might want to hedge our bets on another planet. Like, let's just seed that for a second. But then, and say like, hey, wow, I'm so glad that we had long-term thinking to tell us that. You might also say like, well, but also if you want to have a long-term human civilization that thrives, you want to figure out like how to get rid of nuclear weapons, right? That's like priority number 1 or 2 or 3. How do you not have like some significant portion of people on the planet like in some state of deprivation, right? And generating the kind of conflicts and misery, that could lead to the use of those weapons, right? Mm-hmm. There's a whole host, I think, of kind of potential long-termist priorities that could come before kind of space civilization. When I think about the various ways that Elon Musk might have gone wrong in his thinking, I don't think it's because he's exclusively thinking or even over-indexing on the long term. It's like he's making one long-termist argument for like a particular goal that, to be honest, like I think he already has.
Yeah. And I think this is another sort of like tree ring moment in your career, because you interviewed Elon Musk very early on in this, around like 2015. Yeah. And there's the interesting SpaceX story of like why he built the first rocket, because he like went and tried to do this deal with like the Russians. Yeah. And like it was like a weird bribe situation that all fell apart. Now here we are today because the Russians were mean. But he did end up building his own rocket with this goal. But I think the most telling thing I read in your article was like, he's like building this rocket. He's saying that SpaceX is only 12 years old right now. We're definitely going to Mars by 2040, which is actually like, I mean, I don't know, not that far off on his timeline at this point, maybe. And you mentioned that he's thinking of a bigger ship, the Mars colonization situation. I was actually at Yuri Milner's house like the first time the SpaceX presentation happened for that thing. It was,
really?
Yeah, it was crazy.
I never heard that story.
And I was like, wow. I was like, you're going to build a ship that big? But it was the right picture. And I was like, cool. Wow. But the most telling anecdote in this story, I think, is that people are going to have to pay their own way to Mars. Like everybody who wants to go to Mars has to pony up $500,000, which is like, I think says a lot more about what he's thinking about than anything else. Cause he's trying to, this is the stuff of dystopia and it's like baked into the vision.
Yeah. Certainly living on Mars is the stuff of dystopia.
Yeah.
Yeah, like in a cave, like quite grim.
Yeah.
Grim.
They don't tell you all the bad stuff. Like you have to heap dirt on top of yourself so the radiation doesn't hit you. So you're living in a cave underground. Like it's like you'll never go outside.
Well, the other thing that people don't appreciate because of the color palette of Mars is that like they look at it and they're like, oh, like Arizona. And it's like, no, it's freezing. Like it's like I did a story on Antarctica last year that took me to the ice sheet in Greenland, and like in some places it was like 30 below. And I do remember being up there thinking like, wow, it's like 3 times colder than this on like the warmest day in Mars. So Mars, terrible place to live. Dystopian.
Yeah, don't go. Yeah, terrible place to go. But whatever. Yeah. I mean, you got to go somewhere, I guess.
Totally.
To speak to long-termism on the space front, I think you can take Elon Musk and his short-sighted journey to get to the next planet over, but there is like this sort of always been this idea about like what it means to be really out there, like what it means to look for anybody else that's really out there.
Oh yeah.
And it's not just like getting to Mars and saving humanity. It's also kind of about communication and discovery. And Elon doesn't talk as much about that, but I mentioned Yuri Milner a little bit earlier. Who is Yuri Milner?
Yuri Milner is technically a tech investor who made a bunch of money being one of the earliest investors in Facebook, and then again TikTok. So he's made some great bets in the consumer tech space. But with that money, he is really interested in big science bets, stuff that traditional funding agencies won't go after. He's really sought to legitimize some of those fields. And one that's I've been thinking about quite a lot for the last 10 years as the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And they were doing such small sample sizes, it was like some of those early projects were like, let's go look at these 3 stars, and like hope that we hear something. And Yuri's project, Breakthrough Listen, partly because they really recruited some fabulous radio scientists, have just partnered with every radio observatory on the whole planet. So every night they're basically like whatever those observatories are looking at, they're also doing a search for communications or any kind of technological activity that would indicate that you had a technological civilization there, which is a really cool science project and an awesome thing to stand up with, your tech money.
I remember I went to Yuri's house once, which like is in the hills above Silicon Valley. And this is when I first heard like this presentation from somebody at SpaceX about these like giant ships that were not called starships yet, and saw the pictures that now we see in reality. Yeah. These things do come to pass. By the way, his house, like on the inside is like bright yellow, and there's like these giant like LCD panels on all walls that like cover the entire ceiling that just show you the universe as you walk through.
So cool.
It's wild. But that was also the day I learned about the other aspect of the Breakthrough Project, which was like another voyage. Starshot.
Yeah.
What is that?
Starshot is really cool. The idea is that, instead of using rocket propulsion or even like, there's a famous science project at NASA for years and years called Project Orion. And the idea was to basically use nuclear explosions to drive a starship. But all those starships have quite a big ship in mind, right? That you've got to push with these huge propulsive explosions of one kind or another, chemical rockets, nukes, whatever it might be. And the idea here was of Breakthrough Starshot, is that you would do very thin kind of wafer-like probes that would be very simple. They'd have like, a camera, a few sensors to take data, and they'd be kind of like on a sail, very thin, very cheap. And you'd float them out to space, one out after another, but like truly hundreds or thousands of them. And then you have a laser on the base of the Earth. And this is none of this is experimental physics. Like this is all very easy to make. You have a big laser, although there are political complexities, as you might imagine. And you just wallop these things one after another, and they can go to Alpha Centauri in within a human lifetime, within maybe 10 years. And to give you an idea of how much of an acceleration it is, our fastest spacecraft that we have now, if you were to point it directly at Alpha Centauri, which is our closest star, it would take like on the order of tens of thousands of years to reach there. And so to do this in like 15, 20 years by walloping these little wafers that then would send us images back is really cool science.
Yeah, but let's just go back to the first part a little bit. How does that work? How does a laser push anything?
Well, so it's a solar sail. It's light, So like you get these like very thin material sails that you push them with a photon. In fact, Oumuamua, that space rock that flew into our star system a couple of years ago, which was definitely not the first, but was the first that we saw because of our telescopes are getting so much better. Oumuamua, one of the theories of like why it was kind of moving weird, and they were like, is this thing a probe, right, from some other civilization, was that they thought it was using like huge solar sail technology that had been driven by a laser. Like that is kind of like the theory of the case for how you send these things out, like up to a fraction of the speed of light.
But you've been engaging with this question of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence in a lot of different ways, for quite a while. I don't know if you want to sort of tell me the narrative of how that's come about in your life, and, especially in recent years as you've really begun to focus on it.
Ever since I was a kid, I just thought this was easily the most interesting scientific question. And I want to frame it a little differently, which is just how creative is the universe? So how densely spaced are intelligent civilizations or beings like us? I think that's the real interesting question. And I say how creative is the universe because, the universe has all these parameters, and how often it makes stars and planets and how they organize into galaxies and how those individual systems are able to, this gets back to deep time, to create stable worlds that can allow for the slow evolution of intelligent life. That's what you need. You need these like stable worlds, right? To like kind of nurture this stuff. And, how often are those bubbles popping up across really all of space-time, which could be infinite, right? And in a less creative universe, it could be once every 100 billion galaxies, right? That you get something like us, two people like us having this silly conversation on a Sunday. And then, like there's a more creative universe where like you've got tens or hundreds or thousands per galaxy, right?
What are some of the ways that people have tried to answer that question, and how is it tied possibly to the cultures that they come from?
That's a fascinating way to think about it. First of all, they've been doing nothing but speculation, because I think Carl Sagan still has the best line on this, which is that like it's an empirical question and will not be decided until there's an empirical answer, right? A couple years ago, I spent some time with Liu Cixin, who's the author of the Three-Body Problem and that whole trilogy in China, and I wanted to go see him because I thought of him as kind of like this sort of like philosopher of first contact from Chinese civilization. He had written this like series of books that were kind of the grand operatic first contact scenario that came out of Chinese science fiction, which has turned out to be like a really vibrant space. They were ahead of some of the dystopias, or some of them.
Like here at the Berger Institute, we're pretty tight with all these like Chinese
Ken Liu and
these Chinese science fiction authors.
And I got to say, shout out to Ken Liu, because not only did he brokered like my connection to Liu Cixin, but also introduced me to like a whole batch of like Stanley Chen. And the reason I wanted to talk to Liu Cixin is that when I read Three-Body Problem, and it kind of goes into this dark forest theory, that this notion that like everyone should be keeping their head down in the universe, because if you see another civilization, or if another civilization becomes aware of you, they're just like automatically going to terminate you.
Yeah, they're coming for you.
Yeah,
especially if
they're a threat.
Especially if they're like more advanced than you are, which is like if you're seeing them is highly likely just based on a numbers game.
Yes, like any civilization that we find will almost certainly be older than us, just like as a matter of math.
So you're immediately the underdog,
or
assume that you are in the first place. So this dark forest theory is basically this idea that like if you're prey. And you're sitting in a dark forest, you better not make any sounds, because there's something bigger than you out there that's going to come after you.
That emerges from this encounter between the West and East Asia in the 19th century, right? Mm-hmm. Where like, by the Chinese own telling, like they feel that like a civilization with more advanced technology arrived on their shores and started dictating terms to them, right? The British and the Americans were straightforwardly colonial, right? In the way that they went about administering those places and the deals that they struck and. So to me, it's not that I was being so reductivist as to be like, oh, you have your whole idea because that's your history there. But I am interested in why, coming from a Western background, a lot of our, first contact stories like Contact or certainly in the Sagan vein are just much more optimistic, right? Imagine this to be a kind of encounter of transcendence, or even like a kind of necessarily evolutionary step, in our development, which you get also in 2001: A Space Odyssey, one of the other big primary texts in our culture for how we think about first contact. And so Liu Cixin and I went to this place called the Ancient Beijing Observatory, which is like, it's been there for like, I think almost 1,000 years. And they have all these like old instruments there in this like kind of pine shaded courtyard, and talked about, the history of stargazing in China and stargazing in the West, and how that had led to these kind of two cultures of science fiction. But and that ultimately became the first finished chapter of the book that I'm writing, which is kind of tries to break off one part of this question about whether there's intelligent life elsewhere. As I said, my writing career started, writing an essay about the James Webb Space Telescope. That's now in space now.
Yeah.
Took 25 years, from basically when they started planning it. And if you asked me right now, where in the 25 years is the Habitable Worlds Observatory, which would be kind of like the successor to the James Webb, are we? I'd be like year 1 too. You know, one unfortunate thing is that I think that NASA sort of sold the James Webb as being able to do, you know, what this thing would really be able to do, which is like, you know, kind of census a big chunk of nearby stars. Let's say 1,000. I don't know what the exact number is, but like 1,000 to look for signs of life on their atmosphere, which is an awesome thing to do, in my view. I'm distressed that it may be 25 years before we see it. I will say that that is one, you know, we were saying earlier how it's a shame that some of these space conversations all have to loop back to Elon. But I will say that Starship rocket, one of the things that's really cool about it is that it will make building observatories a lot easier, because a lot of the engineering challenges on the James Webb Space Telescope have to do with miniaturization, right? Folding stuff up and fit in a tiny rocket cone.
The nose cone of a rocket is not that big.
No.
It's as big as a school bus roughly, or like a little bit bigger depending on the size of the rocket.
Yeah. And if you got to fit a telescope that's the size of a tennis court in it, which is what the James Webb is, that's really hard and requires lots of little like pulleys and delicate things that have to be like engineered for 20 years or whatever, and have to work at absolute zero, you know, temperatures and. But if instead you have this Starship rocket or a rocket like it that has like a huge cargo bay, that's going to make a lot of stuff really easier. And then, you know, some of the mission designs that I'm interested in, you know, there's one I think called the, I forget the name of it, and I wish I did, but they're talking about building it in a kind of modular way where, you know, how the James Webb has those like pretty golden tiles, like that basically you'd like start going one tile at a time and just kind of spiral out and keep going, on like, you know, stash one on every kind of like Starship launch kind of a thing. And then soon you get like a telescope that even on its own would be like thousands of times as powerful as like something like the James Webb, but then also could use, you know, like the gravitational lensing of the sun to get even crazier powers of magnification. And that stuff's really exciting. I will say that having written about kind of the frontier of space telescopes now for 10, 15 years, it saddens me that the field is not evolving faster, that it's like, it's definitely forward from when it was like when I first came upon it, but like not so much.
It's like curiosity versus conquest.
That's right.
You know, sometimes things seem far away. Sometimes they come faster. Sometimes, you know, AI is a good example of something we thought when you were writing back then that it was going to be very far away.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like all in the land of maybe. But here we are now. We haven't talked much about it. Like, how do you view the last few years, 4 years of our history on this front?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I like, my approach to writing about AI is like, I only like to write about it when there's something very serious happening on the science end of it, the research end of it. Like, as following it as like a business story, I just find to be quite tedious. I had first written about it going to see Nick Bostrom at Oxford. It was like a profile of the Future of Humanity Institute, and really of Nick Bostrom himself.
Who is Nick Bostrom?
Nick Bostrom is the author of Superintelligence and ran the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford for years and years, but really came up with like the whole vocabulary of AI risk, like originated kind of like much of it with him and with his institute. And that was fascinating because obviously a lot of the thinking that goes on in those spaces is still remains, you know, somewhat fringe. But at the time, like I was writing about it, like it just blew my mind that you had like really smart programmers and philosophers that were like sitting in rooms months after months trying to like game out scenarios where you would have like a super intelligent AI and how you would like possibly hope to control it in a way so that it would not, you know, have some kind of deleterious effects on human civilization. And I thought that was just so fascinating that there was this group of people doing this, like just even as a cultural activity. But that just did tell me that maybe the technology was like a little further along than I thought, because I was like early machine learning kind of revolution. Like they were all kind of in the Hinton mix. But other than that, I kind of was like, found AI to be like quite boring for a few years. But then like all of us, like the ChatGPT moment was just, it's still astonishing.
I remember this whole time when ChatGPT came out, like it was like November 2022, December, like around there. And it was like this huge explosion because everybody like finally cottoned on to what was going down. And like they gained like 100 million users in 5 days or something crazy like that. And everybody's all rah, or everybody's all talking about doom and like death and existential risk, or like the AI is coming to save us all and send us all to paradise like in the next 3 months.
Yeah.
But you weren't writing about that. You were writing about something else. You were already looking at a problem that was to come.
Well, that's a generous way to frame it. But the first story that I did about this AI moment was about the title of it was like, what happens when AI has read everything? And what it was not let me underline this part. It was not an insight that was original to me. There was this group, this kind of an industry think tank called Epoch, who did a white paper just being like, hey guys, like these things are going to run out of text. Like there actually isn't that much text, if you read at the speed that these things do. And even the amassed cultural output of all humans for all time that have been recorded so far, these things read so fast that like they got to the edge of it like 6 months into like the LLM paradigm, right? Yeah. That's incredible.
I pulled some numbers from your article just to like look at here. So I'll paraphrase a little bit, but it's like, since Gutenberg, since the press, humans have published more than 125 million titles, laws, poems, myth, essays, histories. Epoch, the guys you just mentioned, estimate that 10 to 30 million of these books have been digitized, giving AIs billions, if not more than 1 trillion words to read. You like big numbers. You're a big numbers guy.
I do. Yeah. The sublime.
Those numbers may sound impressive, but they're within the range of the 500 billion words that train the model that powers ChatGPT.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing about this was that the quality of the words matter. So you're a very good writer.
Yes. Wow. No,
but you are a good writer.
Not
but like there are a lot of good writers in the world who work very hard at writing things, and there is this sort of qualitative aspect to like if an AI reads good writing, it makes better things. Not even just like it makes good writing, but it just makes better decisions, makes better logical sense. So the AI actually can't be translated on all our Instagram likes and sort of like half.
Can we like talk about exactly how they figured this out, by the way? Because I think it's so funny, and I'm shamed by it constantly, which is that like as a like just stupid Twitter and Blue Sky and whatever like addict going on for 15 years now. The specific way that they figured this out was that they had like 2 models that they trained on the equivalent amount of text, but one was like a big tweet archive and one was like a corpus of scientific papers and books or whatever. And like just turns out that if you read long form stuff, like it trains your brain way better so far as these AIs were concerned. And so I'm thinking like we all know this intuitively, that like when you're reading books or you're reading like longer thoughtful things that like a human mind just takes some months or years to like produce, that it's actually better for you cognitively, and like the proof's in the pudding on this.
Now we're actually seeing this reality. Like there was a sort of like rash of articles last year, I guess it was, or earlier this year, about how the AI isn't getting smart as fast.
Yeah.
Freaking out about the money that's been put into them, and like that they're not quite living up to what we think, and that the reason that they aren't living up to what we think is that they've run out of stuff to read.
Yeah.
These people were right about that. And so one sort of like thing that you posit in this article is that maybe the AIs could make up their own words and they could just read themselves in order to get smarter. Whatever became of that.
Yeah, they're doing tons of it. So it's called synthetic data, right? Which is that the LLMs, can just chunk text out at a trivially large pace. And so a lot of the training data for some of the newest models is synthetic, which is just remarkable. Yeah, they very quickly ran out of stuff of ours to read. But I think just to connect, like going beyond the fact that limits on training data are a serious constraint, at least for like the LLM paradigm, right? Like if we think that LLMs are going to be, the technology that gets us to like really next level AI, if that's the case, and it may not be the case. Maybe there's lots of reasons to think it's not the case. But if it's the case, the fact that like there's a limited amount of training data and that's a real problem is fascinating. But the other thing that doing that piece made me think about, that I really has stayed with me as we've kind of traveled through this really rapid evolution of these large language models, is just like the way we think about them is so shaped by the interface, by the fact that it's a chatbot. And we think about like, is it intelligent? You're conceiving of it almost as a person. But I think if you just think of it as like an interesting filter on like the sum total of humanity's cultural output, not just like our writing, but like our visual art, our photography, everything that they've like been able to inhale that, and that in some sense we can like talk to some collective of that, right? Then it matters a little less. Like we don't have to be so deep in the question of like, well, does it hallucinate, or like how accurate is it? Humans really aren't accurate, right? It just becomes like an interesting thing to talk to, even as like an art project or as a cultural product that didn't exist, just like an encyclopedia didn't exist before that. Go back 2,500 years, like history books didn't exist, and now you have one that's like a total polymath that you can talk to. I just think that there's an impoverished imagination, I think, in the way that people talk and think about these models.
Yeah, but they're also imagining a world where they won't get paid for any of this stuff. So like, there's like,
tell me about it.
Like,
yeah,
I mean, like the economics behind. So like, all that's well and good and cool and lovely, and maybe it will lead, and it does lead to great things. But like, until humans can exist alongside of that from an economic or a data dignity or like any kind of like personal sovereignty over anything they create, until there's a governance model for that, I think that we are looking at something that is a detriment. Because as the way it's currently framed, they are stealing, I think.
Well, then you might think of it like streaming music, right?
Well, that was also bad.
I know. Well, and yet, right?
I mean, it's bad. It's cool to get every music you want all the time, but like when all the benefit in terms of like how society is structured accrues to one winner.
I would say that we definitely need to negotiate a better, and I mean we in the broadest sense, a better system for how we deal with these technologies. And that does actually go for streaming music, and it goes for large language models. Like it can't be that humans who have actually produced the cultural output are just made extinct by this. And also, of course, the labor market. And I don't even know what to think about how we get to a solution on that. Only that, it's imperative that we do.
But then there's kind of the one last thing here of the AI, which I don't think we've ever had this conversation. So we're about to have it a little bit. Consciousness and AIs.
In the current models?
Wherever you want to go. In the future.
Yeah. I'm a hard no on the current models. I think that's just like a misunderstanding of what an LLM is. Unless we mean something like really abstracted, about like, oh, well. And I say that mostly because they're latent, right? Like they don't do anything until you kind of throw your tokens into them. So I don't think of that as being conscious or aware, really in any sense. As far as the future, I'm like very open to it. I don't see any particular direction of AI that strikes me as being like about to trip and fall over into consciousness. I don't see it on the ground yet, but I am, I guess, a kind of lightly committed physicalist when it comes to consciousness in general, right? And so like, I think that it's possible to make consciousness with like atoms that orient information in some particular way. And like for us to be able to do that artificially, like doesn't seem impossible to me at all.
What would you be looking for?
At the very minimum, the thing plausibly saying that it was conscious and being like quite committed to that viewpoint, all we have for ourselves, right, is the cogito ergo sum, so you at least want to see that on their side of things. But in terms of like external behaviors, I have not done a deep dive on like kind of the like evolving literature over and above the Turing test, after like ChatGPT just like smoked the Turing test, right?
Yeah, just like blew by it, like it's not even interesting anymore.
Not interesting. I have not kept up, with like kind of where they land now on kind of what like the actual like benchmarks are. I have thought about this from the other direction in organisms. When I say organisms, I should say, there's a huge scientific literature on which animals might be conscious. Of course, you have the usual suspects, whether it's like the big cats, or like, elephants or dogs or primates, like
whales.
We love the whales. There's obviously really, really good evidence, in just the behaviors of those animals that they're conscious. But like when you start getting further away from humans on kind of the tree of life, right? Like into like birds, and then like even all the way to insects, these are creatures that we diverged from evolutionarily 300 million years ago, let's say. And for us to both be kind of like traveling a path where we have consciousness. Well, that gets back to my point about that I actually think that it's quite easy for nature to make consciousness, It's doing a lot of it, seems to me.
Yeah.
But when you look at the various behaviors in animals, and the things that they do, it's always still a circumstantial case. That's why I said I'd actually be looking for the things that say I'm conscious.
Yeah.
Really convincingly, because self-report is actually as good as it gets. Otherwise, you can usually tell some kind of like story, and it's a just so story about behaviors that you see externally being caused by non-conscious processes. Again, I don't subscribe to them. Like there's people that don't think dogs are conscious. Like I live with a dog. I don't know how you can come to that conclusion if you've like lived for a dog, or lived with a dog for even a day.
Yeah.
But yes, the evidence base is really, really difficult.
Yeah, I want to stay with the computers just for 1 second. I once heard Eliezer Yudkowsky, who's like kind of like one of the main doomers, like sort of like really hard line, like we're all going to die
Totally.
Very soon, which is a viewpoint. This all kind of gets into theory of mind, which is like my ability to imagine that you have consciousness as being sort of like a prerequisite for consciousness. And on the theory of mind front, there's this kind of what you were just alluding to, this faith-based aspect. Like, I have faith that you are conscious, therefore you are conscious. And so what he said about AGI, which is kind of funny, is that as soon as 50% plus one of people believe that the AI is conscious, then it is conscious.
That's interesting. Yeah, I guess I am still like more interested in the self-report rather than like the external appraisals.
But you were just talking about animals, and so like the whole conversation was framed in terms of who thinks what levels of animals are conscious.
But that's not a causal relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're saying it's similar to me saying that like, oh, like for any particular species, if a preponderance of scientists were to say that animal is conscious,
that would be the tick off, right?
Yeah, maybe. Although I don't know, what are the criteria? I do think there's like a fundamental mystery underneath it. Like, and this is the Nagel, what is it like to be a bat problem, right? Where like qualia is kind of like just like fundamentally interior in some deep way.
Yeah, you can never know what it feels like to be a bat. If it is like something to be a bat, then the bat is conscious.
Yeah,
I actually prefer that definition, not this one. So you've written specifically about animal consciousness before. This article for The Atlantic that took kind of an interesting path into this question of whether or not animals are conscious.
The way that story came about is that I had been noticing on my own that just paying quite loose attention to certain scientific journals and thinkers in the field, that there had been a lot of research coming out that seemed to demonstrate, at least to my mind, that there was good reason to believe that these different sets of animals were conscious, again, as I said, all the way down to insects. I shouldn't say down, all the way to insects.
Across
across
the
tree.
horn insects.
Trying to get out of the great chain of being. And there's a certain kind of science story that I like to think of as like a lab to lab story. And I just like don't like reading them. It's kind of like you're trying to trace the answer to some question by going like to this scientist lab, then this scientist lab. I went to the bird guy, I went to the insect guy. And so instead, I was trying to think about animal consciousness from like a history of ideas perspective, like who were the first people to really think about this? What cultures really put their money where their mouths were, meaning that like they were so committed to the view that animals were conscious that they actually shaped their ethical behavior. That was kind of the standard I was looking at. And the Jains were really just like out in front of everyone. I mean, 2,500 years ago, they were not eating animals and even taking all kinds of care not even to trample like insects because they thought that these beings were conscious. Like that is a wild evolution of kind of the human moral imagination for that to happen so long ago. And so I instead took the science to the Jains, meaning not that I went and told the Jains, oh, hey, here's what the scientists say, but more that I tried to dip in and out of the science of animal consciousness while on something like a Jain pilgrimage in India.
So who are the Jains and what is Jainism roughly?
When someone asks you who the Jains are, one of your first instincts just to situate them in the broader like history and culture of religion is to be like, well, they're kind of like Hindus. But then if you say that, it's like very contested, right? Mm-hmm. Like the Hindus basically think that the Jains are an offshoot of them, and the Jains very much reject this characterization. But it came about in roughly 2,500 years ago with a cluster of thinkers. And the Jain stronghold is really in Gujarat in India. And so I went to this mountain temple there, was kind of where the piece culminates, but also a few other like Jain temples in Mumbai, and then also south of Accra, where the Taj Mahal is. If you keep going down along the river there's a very small town where like what you might think of as a Jain saint, which is not how they would characterize it, but just for these purposes. There was a figure there who was very influential and who was kind of the first who seemed to have really keyed in on animal suffering. There's this like very evocative story where he hears animal screams on the day of his wedding, and like it kind of like derails his entire life because he can't unhear it. And I thought that was a really poetic idea.
There's also the guy who cuts off his own arm and his own leg rather than hurt an animal.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, that was like
that was wild.
The iconography of Jainism is like big on these types of stories. It's like respect for consciousness wherever you may find it. But I basically went to like his hometown, and then went and did the kind of, after he left his own wedding, he supposedly went to this mountain temple. And so that's where I climbed. And so, yeah, I've been thinking a lot this year about animism. There's earlier this year, Robert McFarlane published a book called Is a River Alive? And I had an advanced copy of it. I was looking at it, and I think there's a current movement along a lot of different fronts to like bring a kind of scientific respectability to some kind of pretty straightforwardly animist ideas about whether, like rehabilitating Gaia theory being one strand of this, the rights of nature being another, whether you think of having like applying something like personhood to a river, at least as far as the court of law is concerned. And yeah, I think that's far afield from is the universe conscious, but you can take the animism all the way down. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a river. It doesn't have to be a planet. It could be, you think about what a galaxy is and whether there are like Gaia, like, kind of like regulating mechanisms at work there. And then you think about like a universe that generates itself from nothing. That seems really animist to me. Whether it's conscious is a separate question, but it does seem like it's like living in some like deep way that I don't think is currently captured by the science.
Which is why you're here at the Berggruen Institute for our multi-species constitution drafting event.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am excited to be a part of that project. It's been really stimulating. I've met some amazing people, many of which I suspect you'll have on the podcast.
What it does point to is sort of this spiritual aspect of all this, which is now treading from humans into animals and now into computers a little bit. And you're seeing this in real time in our politics and all these debates, which used to be like the domain of the Long Now or Nicholas Bostrom, are now like kind of central to the way we think of ourselves as a nation all of a sudden, because all these Silicon Valley ideologies that started maybe with Stuart Brand back in the day have now taken their own paths to where you have like the accelerationists who are trying to get things to come faster. You have the doomers who are like, no, like God is coming to kill us all in the form of an AI. And I think like very quickly these arguments in the last 4 or 5 years have gone from being sort of like technology driven, scientifically driven, to even among people who are technologically and scientifically minded to be more spiritual or belief driven. And I think that is trickling out into society broadly in our politics. People like making AI images of Trump. All this stuff has become very real, very fast.
Yeah, no, it does seem like history and technological history in particular is like accelerating in a way that and not with like a discernible, arc bends towards justice way. Yeah, I mean, just even quite apart from the politics, just like our literature and films right now are just like shot through with this stuff.
Yeah. Full on dystopia.
Yeah.
Like we create, like it's like, why are you imagining that reality? You know we're going to create it, right?
Yeah. I did want to say briefly, again, not to be overly defensive for the long-termists, but like the environmental movement is a long-termist movement. The nuclear non-proliferation movement is a long-termist movement. The people who like first started being like, hey, wait, can we actually like knock out infectious diseases? That's a long-termist movement. Yeah. Yes, there is these cluster of people in our culture who have now seized the reins, of our culture and our civilization, even politically, and seem to be going in like really alarming directions. But I don't think it's right to think of them as like long-termists first and foremost. I think they've like borrowed some ideas and enthusiasms from those worlds that they kind of already had.
Yeah.
around conquest, and just like straight expansion and wealth and, that.
How big is your rocket?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Totally.
I want to talk about an article of yours that just came out recently in the Atlantic that also takes on some of these questions of existential risk from a very practical, real aspect. Can you tell me a little bit about the article?
Yeah. Earlier this year, I spent some time in South Korea and Japan kind of talking with the national security intelligentsia in both places about whether they might go for nuclear weapons. And there's a few different pressures that are kind of pushing them to do that and think about it seriously. China, this is weirdly like not on the radar of most people, but is engaged in like the most rapid nuclear buildup since like the kind of peak of the Cold War, slamming together like something between 100 and 150 warheads a year, looking to have a kind of US or Russia sized arsenal like within 10 to 15 years, slotting them all in the silos, like in the hinterlands, where we would have to kind of like target them in order to have like meaningful deterrence with them, which means then we have to build more, right? So there's like really scary proliferation story in China. Then you have North Korea, which already has almost 100 warheads and maybe getting up to like 200 or 300 within the next 5 to 10 years. And that's certainly like the ambition. And there's no reason to think they won't. And while all that's happening, if you're South Korea or Japan, you've got these like major nuclear dangers right in your backyard. The credibility of the United States commitment to its allies' security is being diminished significantly by the day right now in the history that we're living through. This isn't like a Pax Americana world anymore. And so my story took me to Seoul and Tokyo and ultimately Hiroshima, where I spent some time with some of the atomic bomb survivors there, just to think about what it means that we have nuclear proliferation in East Asia and where that future might be leading us.
Can you put a little bit of a finer point on that? Why is it so important to look at specifically Japan and South Korea?
I think of it more from a regional perspective. So that's why I say East Asia. So, we know what's happening in China. That's the fastest proliferation story in the world. So that's one reason to look at Asia. And then when you think about what it would mean if South Korea and Japan went nuclear, not only would that just mean that we have kind of like an India-Pakistan situation now all the way in East Asia as well. So you have more proliferation there, but we've never had like a member in good standing of the non-proliferation treaty like South Korea go nuclear. So if they did that, a lot of people think that would be kind of the end of the non-proliferation regime and that you'd have a global proliferation cascade. And there are more reasons to think that would happen. I can talk more about that. But the Japanese, as you may have heard, there's some, it's still quite a tense relationship between South Korea and Japan. And so if the Japanese saw the South Koreans getting their own nuclear arsenal, first of all, that would just be independent evidence that the American security guarantee was like a little wobbly if South Korea felt compelled to do that. And there are many reasons that can happen. But also Japan, they could not abide South Korea having nuclear weapons, and they didn't have any. I think that would be very hard for that culture, even though there is a very strong nuclear taboo there. And so you have like the very soul of the non-proliferation regime because of Hiroshima, because they're the only victims of nuclear war so far. And so if they were to go nuclear, then you really are looking at a situation where there's like no meaningful taboo operating in the entire world. And you already have a situation set up where you could see like an Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey in relatively quick succession. You're already seeing the beginnings of a kind of Poland and Germany conversation in recent months. Earlier this year, the prime minister of Poland said that they should be looking for a nuclear option given what the Trump administration has done in Ukraine, and sent a very clear signal that Europe is on its own for its security.
Sounds like a mad, mad world. I wonder if mutually assured destruction, MAD, is like possible in a world like that. If there's so many players in the game, like who are you mutually assuring non-destruction against? Like mutually assured destruction, this idea of like, we're not going to fire at you because if we did, you would fire at us. But if everybody's pointing guns in sort of like a circular firing squad, how does mutually assured destruction work in a world like that?
Yeah, we don't know if it does. I mean, we don't even know if it works with the kind of easy binary that we had before. We got, 70 years of that. 80 years of that. And that's a small sample size from this long-termist kind of point of view. Even just adding China to that. So now it's a 3-body problem. And then you start adding other nuclear powers, and yeah, the strategic calculus, like even to game theory it out is like really hairy and difficult. But even putting aside whether the like strategy nets out on the international level, when it comes to political leaders, you are kind of throwing the dice. Like you're going to get somewhere on the spectrum from like Caligula to Marcus Aurelius, every time, depending on like your political institutions, and how good they are at like making sure bad people don't end up like with ultimate power. And, some of those systems appear to be quite stressed right now. But anyway, if you have 30 people on the planet who are political leaders in particular countries who are falling on that particular spectrum between Caligula and Marcus Aurelius every year or every 5 years, that's a really risky situation from my perspective versus like 2 powers, and like kind of like a deep history in political institutions. But I spent some time with the governor of Hiroshima, and we live in like a nuclear world. And I think there was this sort of like 20-year holiday where people were like quite happy to pretend that we don't. But I do think that, that sword of Damocles or whatever, is like still hanging over us in a way that people don't fully appreciate.
And if that didn't scare you enough, then people can go to the Atlantic and read your article about what happens when we give AI the nuclear codes.
2 risk vectors coming together.
We'll just leave that one right there for now. But we kind of went from like Aliens and Kubrick, the big baby in the sky, to like Kubrick, the other one with the cowboy riding the missile down.
Let's do Barry Lyndon now.
But I think to go back to the 3-body problem, there is a 3rd book. Mm-hmm. And in the 3rd book, they figure out that they really shouldn't kill each other, and that there's something beyond mutually assured destruction, which is agreement, to disarm, an agreement to be on our own. And that's how that story of destruction that has like a silver bullet that kills everybody and like 500 spaceships actually ends with this pact, this non-aggression pact, which is possible.
Yeah. And I think, the reason that I was so eager to link kind of geopolitical history with this, like these imagined cosmic futures, was precisely this, was that I do think that there's like an arc civilizationally, or I hope there is, where if you can figure out how to achieve some like genuinely international political community on your planet, that then you at least have a shot of doing that out in the universe. Even though there may not be good reason at the current moment, I do retain some like a kind of like heavy optimistic streak. And it's a kind of long-termist intuition that these are early days. Democratic republics are like a few hundred years old. Like our political institutions, like we've just begun experimenting and building these things. And so I do think it's at least possible that we will like find a way to live together in ways that are more peaceful, and that model, would have broad application. I hope so.
All right. Well, Russ, thank you.
Thank you, man. What a blast.
It's good to see you again. And I look forward to seeing you in the future.
Yeah, me too, man. Thanks for having me on.
Futurology is a Studio B and Waveland production with distribution from Realm. Our executive producers are Nicholas Bergruin, Nathan Gardells, Dawn Nakagawa, Nils Gilman, and Jason Hoke. Futurology is produced by Grant Slater, Alex Gardells, and Natalia Ramos. Our associate producer is Alyssa Mardini. Futurology's theme music was composed by Marcus Bagala. The show is mixed and mastered by Aaron Bastinelli. Special thanks to Heather Mason, Olivia De Rienzo, Carly Migliori, and Nick Goddard.